was the Passover to be observed? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Leviticus 23. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 8. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus 23, beginning at verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat of unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The seventh day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. We now come to the fourth section of the book of Leviticus. Recall section 1 of the book consisted of chapters 1 through 7 and talked about the sacrifices under the law. Section 2 consisted of chapters 8 through 10 and talked about the priesthood. And section 3 consisted of chapters 11 through 22 and talked about uncleanness and its removal. The last section is what we just completed over the last 44 episodes. Section 4 will encompass the next 3 chapters, chapters 23 through 25, and will largely deal with the feast days and seasons found in the law of Moses. Besides the 10 Commandments, and perhaps the sin sacrifice, many of these feasts are well known to Christians today, due in part to what happened around each of them. In our study of Exodus, we covered a couple of these feasts, but here in Leviticus, we're going to get more detail. Although we would not think of the Sabbath as a feast day, and it was not, it is called a holy convocation, and thus is mentioned here. A holy convocation is a term that means holy day, but also carries with it some type of gathering or assembly. In Jesus' day, we often read of the Sabbath day being a day of prayer, and a day where the Jews routinely came to the synagogues to worship. On the weekly Sabbath, no work was to be done. They weren't to prepare meals, tend to their fields, or do any unnecessary work. The Sabbath would be observed in all their dwellings, which meant that unlike some of the other feasts, no pilgrimage to the tabernacle was to be required. It would simply be observed wherever one lived. In Exodus 20, verse 11, we get God's reason for establishing the Sabbath in Israel, which was that he completed creation in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. So God gave Israel 6 days to work and commanded that they rest on the seventh day too. This rest day would allow them to focus on God. Today we're not under this law. However, we still need to make time to focus on God and provide rest for our bodies. If we get too focused on our work that we never rest, not only will our bodies break down, but our spiritual life will take a toll too, giving the devil a foothold to draw us away from God. That's why it is wise for Christians to set aside some time to rest and focus on spiritual things. This need not be the same day every week, nor even the whole day, but time does need to be made for such things. Starting in verse 4, we then come to the annual feasts of the Lord, other times of the year when holy convocations occurred. Verses 5 through 8 deal with the first 2 feasts, the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Since these 2 feasts occur in the same month of the Hebrew year, and both occur at practically the same time, it's only logical for God to start this section with these 2 feasts. Lengthier instructions for these 2 feasts were given back in Exodus 12 and 13, so if you want to refresh your memories, we suggest you go to www.youtube.com/EastEndChurchOfChrist and look for lessons 41 through 48 in the Walking Through the Bible Exodus playlist. The day of Passover was actually only one day, the 14th day of the first month of Abib, though preparations began for it on the 10th day of Abib. I would like us to note when the Passover was eaten. It was eaten at twilight on the 14th day of the month. That would mean that it was eaten near the very end of the 14th day of the month, since the Hebrew day began at sundown. This is important if we're to understand the timeline of the crucifixion found in the Gospels. In our studies of Matthew and Mark already, we noted that Jesus did not eat the actual Passover meal the night before he was crucified. That's because the Gospel accounts make it clear, especially when we studied the book of John, the Passover meal was still ahead, and the Passover lambs were being killed at the same time that Jesus was dying on the cross. This is why Paul will refer to Jesus as our Passover in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. The confusion lies with the way the Feast of the Passover and this second feast mentioned here in Leviticus, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, was referred to. Because the Feast of Unleavened Bread began immediately after the Passover meal on the 15th day of the first month, the two feasts were often referred to as one feast, either being called the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Unlike the Passover, which was only one day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread would last 7 days, meaning that in the first month there would be an 8-day feast of the Lord. From Exodus 23:17, we find that this was one of the feasts that all males were required to appear before God of the tabernacle. So this was a pilgrimage feast. On the first day and on the 7th day, there was to be a holy convocation, and no customary work was allowed on it. How did this differ from the Sabbath? They were allowed to cook on this day, as Exodus 12:16 says, but they weren't to do any other work. Notice, these holy convocation days for the Feast of Unleavened Bread was not called the Sabbath, though it acted like one. Important to remember for our study of John. Along with that, each day of this feast, they were to offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. We'll get more about this offering, the Lord willing, in our study of Numbers. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus 23, verses 9 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.